Today we're diving deep into one of the most common and often misunderstood challenges in the school system, ADHD. We all know the stereotypes, but how does ADHD really show up? And more importantly, how does it shift and change as a student moves from an elementary classroom to the high school hallway? The difference in symptoms and supports is huge, and getting the right plan is everything. Pour yourself a cup of coffee, because today we have someone here to help guide us through the journey. Hi, and welcome back to Special Ed IEPs 504's Oh My, Conversations with DCSEAC. I'm your host, Meredith. Today I have Kelly joining me from the board. We have a very exciting guest. She is the school psychologist at my son's elementary school, and she's also the one that made the recommendation for this topic. Today we're going to welcome Dr. Erin Grell. Dr. Grell, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you for having me.
Do you want to tell us about yourself before we jump in?
Sure thing. I am a school psychologist, have been for 14 years in Douglas County, been around Highlands Ranch at a couple schools, and currently I am working at Saddle Ranch Elementary 3 days a week. I also do part-time private practice.
Jumping into our topic, today we're going to be talking about ADHD and how it impacts students throughout the school years. How does a school psychologist diagnose and confirm ADHD's educational impact?
This is a really great question because it can be confusing for parents. ADHD is a clinical diagnosis, and schools are looking at educational identifications, and ADHD actually falls under a very broad category called other health impairment, which can encompass any sort of medical or clinical diagnosis. We can identify students who might have ADHD in the school setting by looking at if they are somewhat impacted either academically or with regards to their social skills or their social interactions, behaviorally, or with their executive functioning skills. It's a very in-depth process that we go through, a lot of observations, a lot of rating scales. We're doing standardized assessments. It takes a good chunk of time to do, but it's something that can be done in the schools.
Sometimes we've been told ADHD is a medical diagnosis, not something the school will bring up. I believe that's changed. My own student has an educational autism diagnosis. I did not take him to a private neuropsych. He was young and ADHD wasn't looked at. The school did an evaluation and that's where he landed. Sometimes the parents think you have to spend a lot of money and wait a long time to get a private diagnosis, which the school may or may not take. They only have to consider it. If you have big concerns and your school is sharing those concerns, you can have a conversation about that.
Even though you have the medical diagnosis, you said a little bit about this, it doesn't automatically qualify him, but a parent can bring that, and I believe the school will look at that. Dr. Grell, do you have anything else you want to tack on to that?
The importance of medical diagnosis versus clinical diagnosis versus school-based identification is a tricky one. At any point, if there's concerns in the school setting, the school is obligated to hold a referral meeting to discuss those concerns with the parents. The team does agree to move forward with evaluate or wait and see and collect other data. It doesn't have to be like, I think it is this particular thing. It could just be like, I'm really worried about their reading and their emotions.
And I ran into this last year with a friend's daughter, and the concern was the teacher said you need to get a medical diagnosis of ADHD. She is a great teacher, but that just seems to scare parents to think they can't go to the school first. The students should be talked about amongst teams like our MTSS. A student can be brought into that even though they're not receiving services. Do you have any recommendations for how can we help teachers?
A lot of that comes down to training of gen ed teachers, which most gen ed programs do not do a sufficient job in teaching special education. Unfortunate for our gen ed teachers who are trying hard to support students with different needs. If that's happening in the schools, making admin aware of it, because the SPED team knows that's not okay. And we communicate that with teachers in IEP meetings. If that is happening, the school administration needs to be made aware.
Parents need to understand when they're little itty bitties, you can be categorically eligible. So you have a diagnosis, you get services, even though you're not at that point showing deficit. That is not how education works. You don't need all the answers. Just say, hey, I feel like there's a problem. Or the teacher needs to say, hey, I feel there's a problem. Then you go to MTSS. That team will meet and say, we see this. Here are some suggestions. Try that for 8 weeks. Collect data on how it's going. Then we're going to meet again. I'm like, oh, that didn't work. Now we're going to try more intervention. Eventually they'll say, this isn't working, and put in for an evaluation for special education. We could do a whole podcast on that. It's important for parents to know you don't have to figure out what the problem is. All you have to say is, I'm worried.
Bring it up and have those conversations. Like, what interventions have you tried? What is the single biggest misconception parents have when they first suspect that their child has ADHD?
The only thing that's going to work is if I put my kid on medication, and that's not necessarily true. It is one of the most effective treatments for ADHD. There are other things that can be done to the environment to support the student. A lot of skills need to be taught to the student in order to make sure that they can access their school environment and their other environments like soccer or gymnastics or whatever they may be doing.
How is ADHD addressed through either an IEP or a 504 plan accommodation?
So 504s are generally typically only providing accommodations, and those are things in the classroom that must be set up to support that particular student. It may be things like extra time, visual checklists, organization tools. It's not direct services for the student, whereas an IEP is intended to provide those direct services by specialized providers in order to ensure that they're gaining the skills that they need in their learning environments. A lot of students with ADHD are going to have an area of academic deficit, usually writing. A lot of kids with ADHD hate writing. They might need occupational therapy. They might need mental health support with regards to social skills or behavioral regulation. Even some might need social language skills through the speech-language pathologist.
Moving on, the visible signs. How does ADHD typically manifest in kindergarten and early elementary?
A lot of parents ask, isn't this like normal boy behavior when they see a kiddo running around crazy at a park or something? The difference is that kiddos who don't have ADHD can turn it off usually when necessary. So if it's time to watch a movie, they're probably going to sit in front of the TV a little bit more, whereas a kiddo with hyperactive ADHD is still maybe going to be standing up and moving around, fidgeting, turning around, asking questions during the movie. That's a significant indicator. There might be more going on than typical behavior. With girls, early on, you probably won't see it. It's going to look more like daydreaming, maybe not responding to questions.
And then would you say girls might be identified later because they are more to themselves?
Yes, girls who are identified later in life, it's because they are so quiet. They tend to go under the radar. They're often considered compliant. Maybe they just aren't being paid much attention to in class because although they may not be getting all their work done, they're not acting out. They're not causing a disruption by being overly hyper. They just tend to be quiet and looking out the window.
I hear from parents they're afraid their child will be labeled if diagnosed with ADHD. How would you counter that?
It's a good point, and that comes across for almost any type of neurodevelopmental disability, this idea of a label. Within the school setting, we often emphasize with parents that the need for special education or a learning plan is based on the student's needs rather than that eligibility definition or label. So if a student with a traumatic brain injury needs occupational therapy, that's the same as a student with ADHD who might need occupational therapy. They're still going to receive that service on their IEP. The student will have an educational identification to guide the team in determining areas that could be supported. It's also for state reporting purposes in order to have a better understanding of how many kids are presenting with these various disabilities or eligibility categories. But in the long term, it's about the student's needs. How can we support them in and out of the school setting?
I found from personal experience that kids can be more accepting in kindergarten, first, second grade, but when the behaviors are not addressed, that their peers have less patience. And ultimately, it can harm the kid if those issues aren't addressed because they get annoyed that you're interrupting or pushing.
We start to see an increase in identification of ADHD in the mid-elementary years simply because of that reason. Once the parents realize that their student is starting to stand out socially, that's what's hard to hear, that your child is not being accepted, maybe acting different, and that's often what triggers the identification process between that and the academics that may be starting to be impacted.
How might inattentive, and you touched on this with girls, inattentive type ADHD be missed in the younger grades?
When thinking about boys with inattentive ADHD, even when older, they can come across as oppositional in a withdrawn way. You may ask them something and not get a response, and they're not paying attention, not ignoring you or arguing in their head with you. I see that carry over into the older grades. They still seem oppositional, and that's the theme that the school has carried forward, that they're just not trying, they're not caring. And reality is because they aren't listening because of whatever else is going on in their head.
Is that missed in the screening?
I think a lot of it is going to depend on the perspectives of the people completing the initial screeners. We ask for teacher and parent input on this. And if they have a lens already that this child is oppositional or behaviorally deficient in some way, then that's going to be the lens with which they portray the student and their rating scales. It's up to the clinical or educational team to really separate that out from what might be actually going on.
I've heard a term recently where some students are masking their behaviors. They might be quieter, so they don't have the hyperactivity component, attempting to go under the radar. Are you seeing a lot of that? I feel like those kids would be harder to identify.
Yeah. So the masking concept is originally stemming from autism. Kids who are older, like middle and high school, are starting to recognize they are different and don't feel comfortable. They put forth extra effort to appear typical, causing their brain to work harder in these situations, which then fatigues them, which then contributes to all sorts of other problems. I think the younger kiddos, they haven't quite learned that metacognitive skill yet, so they are just putting it out there. But definitely the older kiddos are showing those masking signs.
What academic areas are first impacted by poor executive functioning in K through 5th grade?
Typically, students have preferred areas based on their areas of preference and their areas that they know are stronger for them. But in reality, executive functioning skills impact all parts of a student's day, not just at school, it's at home as well. The one that really is very impacted is writing. Writing is a very difficult process for most people because it starts in your head. You have to organize thoughts in your head. Then it has to transfer to the motor movement onto the paper, which a lot of kids with ADHD don't like to have control over their hand in order to form the letters perfectly. So you're going to see a lot of difficulty with handwriting. So a lot of writing skills are impacted by students who have ADHD.
How is that different from dysgraphia?
Dysgraphia is a specific learning disability in the area of writing. It's different because with dysgraphia, they are trying to identify what types of thoughts they need to get out, whereas kids with ADHD have the thoughts, but they're having trouble organizing them and planning them and then getting them out. Whereas dysgraphia, they are having trouble even developing the thoughts.
That kind of touches with dyslexia. You hear these concerns from parents, and this is just so broad, but how are you or even any clinician assessing for all neurodivergent? Because there's definitely does seem to be a lot of overlap.
I was told by our pediatrician there's a 40% comorbidity rate, whether anxiety, depression, or a learning disability. Is that what you find?
We are definitely seeing those comorbidities, not just with neurodivergence, but also with social emotional difficulties. Early on, you're going to see maybe more of the academic impact, and later on, you're going to see more of the mental health side, knowing that you're looking different than others or that you can't control some of these things that are happening to you.
We've been touching on this in other podcasts just because twice exceptional students seems to be newer to the district. Supporting our 2E students, I would assume ADHD would be one. What would you say maybe would be numbers? I know we probably don't have all the data.
There's strong evidence that kiddos with ADHD often present higher cognitive skills in one or two areas. There's never usually a question of intelligence with ADHD. That's not what it's about. Very much, yes, students with ADHD also have the capability to be identified as gifted, and that is done through the whole identification process, partial of which is going on through the special education process as well.
I was just wondering supports. I know we have another board member whose student is twice exceptional. The behaviors are the difficulty. Wrapping around all of that, is that something newer to the team, trying to address the exceptional
That is a really good point. I think this might be my 4th year that we've had a full-time GT coordinator out of all my years in the district. Before that, you would see the really high achievers that didn't have any developmental delays or disabilities in any capacity be the ones going with that GT coordinator. And now we have several students at our school who are on IEPs who are also receiving that gifted level of support from our GT coordinator.
As shifts hit and puberty happens, why does hyperactivity often decrease, but inattention and executive dysfunction get worse?
Part of the reason for the decrease in hyperactivity is as students become more aware of the atypicalness of their behavior, they are working harder to try to calm that hyperactive part of them down. But tasks in middle and high school become much more independent. They become more difficult. They require more organization and planning. They're not just, here's this worksheet and get it taken care of in 10 minutes. It's, here's this project that's going to take you all week. And those are the types of activities exceptionally difficult for kids with ADHD.
Increased academic load, breakdown of routines, managing their emotions, that regulation piece. How does that present different at school versus at home? And how can we support that?
Kids tend to hold things together at school and then release at home. That's just typical for all of our kids. Kids with any difficulty in the school setting who are working even harder at school to hold it together, they're really going to come home and release. Some kids will do that externalizing, which means there will be the shouting, crying, and screaming. And then there will be some kids that show internalizing behaviors where they're withdrawing, not talking, and might just go shut themselves in their room, which is a bigger concern because you don't know what they're experiencing and they're not communicating.
Kelly has 9 children, 6 of them with ADHD. Do you have some insight that you've gone through with the kids? What's been successful, what hasn't?
Yes, I have a lot of kids and young adults with ADHD. I have parented children with ADHD all the way to adulthood, and it does change quite a bit. When they're little, like you talked about, the hyperactivity component, and that sort of subsides as they get older. The masking bumps up. What I have found to be the most successful strategy is to find their people. Many of my children with ADHD are not particularly coordinated, which is great because I'm a terrible sports parent. Band has been their safe place. And when they got into middle school and high school, it is a very accepting, warm place. My children go to Thunder Ridge High School in the band, choir, orchestra, and theater. And so the kids are called B-wingers, and that is their safe space. I think that is paramount to their success, finding that safe space. I have gifted kids, and it's difficult when your child is identified as gifted. If they are not happy and connected socially, nothing else matters. I even had one of my children, who's an adult now, articulate that if it wasn't for band, he would have dropped out of high school. He said, nobody goes to high school for Algebra 2. No offense, math teachers.
Sounds like finding your people. And do you think that's more within middle school versus elementary?
For elementary, at least for my family, has been a profoundly difficult time because their ADHD, they do start to notice that they stand out. I don't have great suggestions for that. When they get to middle school and they're able to pick at least a little bit of their electives, that can help a bit. I loved what you touched on before. The lens at which you see the world is very important. And when people have had great training about neurodiversity or trauma, and you see the world through those lenses, you realize a student is having a hard time, not giving you a hard time. And they're doing the best they can at that time. I think it's hard to keep that lens on. I still struggle with that. As they got into high school, finding a pathway to success for them is incredibly important. That was not available to some of my older kids. We didn't have many pathways. It was college or nothing. Once identified as gifted, the expectation is college. I'm excited. The district now has 21 different pathways. It's incredible. So I think as we tell teachers, backwards plan your kids' lives. Have in-depth conversations of where do you see yourself? What are things that are interesting to you? And try to fit them into those pathways. There's lots of ways to define success. Not everybody's going to Harvard, and that's okay. You can still have a successful life and buy a house if that's what you want. But it does take planning and a lot of conversations.
How does the advocacy change when you're attending these IEPs and 504s? What dynamic changes that you see as they grow up and how you have to advocate?
Yes. It takes a lot of advocacy. For my youngest, I had his IEP meeting recently, and there was an evaluation. It's just part of the evaluation, and it was interviewing each teacher. What are the areas of concern? So it was a very deficit-based. This teacher says he's not paying attention. He's not making eye contact. And after a couple of them, I said, I'm going to stop you right there. I have a daughter with a physical disability who does not have working arms. Doesn't have bicep muscles, so she is not going to brush her own teeth. Invisible disabilities are much trickier to advocate for. Some people believe it's intentional and believe that we can put in behavior systems. We've had some situations where there's 5 different behavior systems going on. My kid's so overwhelmed, he shut down. I'm looking around the classroom and I'm overwhelmed. Keep bringing it back to the lens at which you see a student, right? If you can keep bringing it back, he's doing the best he can. It does get trickier, and it's okay to insert yourself. As you go from elementary to middle school, you don't have as much interaction. Like, you're not seeing the teachers. You're not seeing if your child qualifies for an educational assistant. You're not brought into the school setting very often. That's tricky. But I would say developing positive relationships with the school staff, with the principals, really helps, because our kids tend to be more immature. Right? They're impulsive. If they get in trouble, sometimes they will say things that they think will get them out of trouble, which actually get them in more trouble. Things that blow up on social media. Having healthy relationships with school staff can be the most powerful thing you can do.
Dr. Grell and I are from a school consolidating. Highlands Ranch is consolidating, and 6th grade is moving into middle school. Parents are losing that last year. Do you, Kelly, or Dr. Grell have any recommendations for those parents to prepare to have conversations with staff and to know what to look for? They lost a year they thought they had to help their student.
Staff is being told not to have transition meetings. We used to have IEP meetings and then have a specific transition meeting as we were transitioning from elementary to middle and middle to high school. Those are being discouraged, but a parent can request one. I encourage parents to request one. If you have struggles, go on the website and find the chain of command to get your needs met. The more interaction you have with the team that's going to be working with your student, the better. They have coffees. My child will be going to Ranchview. I've attended them, even though this is my 9th child to go. Things change. I encourage people to go. There's something called Passport next week. We're going to go to, for my child's school, most middle schools have Peek at the Pack over the summer. You go for, I can't remember, is it like 2 or 3 days? And that's a great opportunity for the kids to feel comfortable. You learn where your things are, where your classes are. Any opportunities can be really helpful.
I agree with everything you said, Kelly. I'm about to experience this myself with my 5th grader with ADHD, and it is nerve-wracking because you go from being able to communicate with your student's elementary teacher whenever about anything, even if it's just a drop-off, to not even being sure who's going to be managing their plan and wondering if this teacher is doing this accommodation and this teacher is not. Do I reach out? Does the student reach out? How is this supposed to work? That's been on my mind lately. With the transition meetings, I know school staff find them incredibly helpful to know who's coming up from 5th grade. It's important to get a solid foundation rather than just reading the document. Requesting those transition meetings, if you're feeling uncomfortable, would be a really good idea.
So you bring up another point. So my concern, homework's hard for kids with ADHD. Their brains are working extremely hard. I'm 1000% sure there's research that they're exhausted. How can a parent advocate and use the right words with our specialists?
One of the important things that kiddos in special ed receive in their older years is a class focused on study skills or mentoring time with someone paying closer attention to them, this random teacher. And kids I hear from are telling me, especially in my private practice, though I'm able to get any homework that I have done in that class during the day so that I don't have to take it home. I ask about homework when interviewing the older kids to get an idea about their functional capacity in the evenings. Almost all of my caseload from Douglas County, and almost all of them are telling me that they have very minimal homework, which is interesting.
I think that's a very interesting point you bring up, because that has been my experience as well. But the elementary is telling us they have to do homework. My school took away homework for several years. Sadly, it's back. So there is this push-pull relationship between the teachers and the parents around homework. I'm old and I'm grumpy. So I just say, yeah, he's not going to do it. And they say, we're just trying to prepare him for middle school. And I said, well, my experience, it's much easier up there. Unfortunately, the district does not have study hall because I've asked. The neuropsychologist we worked with said that would really benefit my child. Because there's no credit attached to it, when you get into high school, I can only speak to Thunderbridge, they have a class called School Success. The teachers are great at connection. They do have a curriculum because they are required to have a curriculum, but there is time within that time to finish homework. The teachers will even do a grade check and reach out to other teachers. This can be really helpful. Unfortunately, parents don't know about it. And my children benefit because I've been in the district for 30 years, but that isn't fair. I do believe in medication for my own children. At the end of the day, they're done. Their brains are done. And so I've had to explain to teachers, like, I send him to you in the best shape. When he comes home, this is not what I receive. When I'm fighting to keep him on an IEP, sometimes our kids can look really good. And then they say, he's doing great. And they want to transition you off the IEP. I say, we have to write the supports for the brain he was born with. You might see when I do all these things to mitigate. It does take a fair amount of advocacy to set your kid up for success.
So medication does change you for qualifying for services? Is that a thing? Or you just have to remind them, like, this is a brain changed on medication, because other parents are probably going to run into this.
It's complicated because if I send my child unmedicated, you're not going to get an accurate IQ because his focus is not going to be there. If I send him medicated, he may present better to a point where he no longer qualifies. So it is such a balancing act. I bring it up at every meeting that this was the brain he was born with. We're doing all these things to mitigate. Now, there is, I believe, law that says you cannot take away supports because of things you use to mitigate behaviors. Sometimes I had a teacher who was lovely and said, I forgot he had ADHD and autism. Sometimes we do such a good job, our kids look good, but they can fall apart easily. What I don't like is when they go, he's doing great, let's take away the support. No, he's doing great because of the supports. So I think that's an important distinction.
I have a funny story about that. My student currently in 5th grade, early on in 3rd grade with one of the best teachers in the world, sent me an email later that day. Hey, your son was really off today, this and that and the other. And she's describing all of this. And I look up at my husband and said, you didn't give him his meds today, did you? My husband did not give him his meds that day. And that was the last day that either of us have not given him his meds.
For teachers, what is one simple classroom strategy that benefits the students with ADHD, but also helps all students?
I encourage all teachers to do, and I often help with this, is teaching the idea of self-monitoring. This can be self-monitoring around anything. It doesn't have to be one specific area, but that is increasing a student's own personal awareness about whatever it is that they need to pay attention to. A lot of times it is their on-task behavior. Sometimes it might be, how are they turning work in? Are they just crumpling up the paper and throwing it at the teacher? Are they following the routine? It could be related to their recess and knowing that they need to engage in an appropriate way with the specific peer. This idea of self-monitoring is ongoing. It can't be taught in one session with a provider for 20 minutes. It has to be ongoing throughout their day, every day.
How do we help them learn to advocate for their own needs within the IEP and the 504? Because it sounds like you prompt a lot, and when their executive functioning's kind of bananas, they might not remember they need to advocate for themselves.
Having them be part of the process can be powerful. It's tricky because it can feel shamey, right? We have to be careful and know where they are developmentally, whether they're ready. Now, it is required in high school. The students have to participate. I have had students that say, I want to be in there for the minimum amount of time. And I've had other ones that really want to have an active role. But I think understanding their accommodations so they can say, I'm receiving them or I'm not, or it's not looking what I thought it would look like. Helping them find their voices is very helpful. And I will say one of the most important things I can do, finding the teachers that are really good at connection When you've struggled with ADHD or autism or any disability your entire life, there's a lot of shame, a lot of shutdown in the parent community. They don't go to parent-teacher conferences anymore. How many times do you want to hear terrible things about your kid? Finding teachers that see the child through the lens of they're doing the best they can change the direction of the student. But it is difficult as a parent to know who those teachers are. So I think if you can have an honest relationship with the school psychologist, counselor, or the principal, and say, above all, this is what my child needs to feel safe and secure and heard, everything else improves.
I think Kelly's spot on. The reason our school has implemented a school-wide community gathering once a month is to make sure that every student in the building knows one adult at least fairly well that they can come to for anything or say hi to in the hallway, passing down the hallway. And in the high school level, that would be even more important because the stakes are higher. I agree with Kelly that it's really important for parents to have an understanding of which teachers are the ones that are connecting with their child.
After high school, Kelly has lots of experience. How do we prepare them for that postgraduate milestone?
So I would say one of the things as a parent that we have to accept that our people, and maybe none of them at this point, are just ready to adult on their own at 18. There's this philosophy that you're 18 and out. And at least in my experience, they have not had the skills necessary for every part. And that's okay. As we transition to each milestone, middle school, high school, and college, or any sort of further education, we need to make sure the scaffolding's in place for them to be successful. Sometimes as we're making those transitions, the next stage is saying they have to advocate for themselves. We don't want to hear from parents. Like you touched on, do I reach out? Does the student reach out? And they'll say the student should reach out. My answer is, how have you prepared them? How have you put the scaffolding in place to prepare them for that skill? It's the same going into adulthood. I have found my students with ADHD love to work. Working is concrete. You do your job, you get a paycheck. Grades were not the same for them. They did not really see the benefit. So if you can get them into the workplace earlier or as soon as they can, I think that is helpful. Legacy has amazing open houses where you can visit and see all the cool stuff they're doing. They're opening up auto mechanics now. They have pilot training, HVAC. They have EMS, like my daughter's going to do the EMS school her senior year. If you can be talking about all the different paths, one of my sons, we backwards planned it. We looked at careers not replaced by AI and growing in the next decade in the state of Colorado. And he landed on surgical technologist. My kids pay for college themselves. They keep that in the back of their mind not to go into debt. And that is only 3 semesters once you've done the prerequisites, and it's got a great starting salary. So there are definitely great pathways for our people that they can be very successful. It takes a lot of conversation, a lot of thought, a lot of planning to set them up for success. Changing the parent mindset that these kids are supposed to have it all figured out is probably not realistic.
As we wrap up today, it's clear that navigating the school years with ADHD is about so much more than what ends up on a report card. It's about the daily invisible lift, the energy that it takes just to sit still, the resilience required to bounce back from a foggy morning, and the courage to keep trying when your brain feels out of sync with the classroom. The school years are a marathon. Executive function. Be sure to check the show notes for any resources that may have been mentioned within this podcast. You can also learn more about DCSEAC on our social medias or go to our webpage, dcseac.org. If you like this podcast, please like, share, and let other parents know about it. We're just trying to get those conversations out there. And if you have any suggestions, definitely just let us know on those social medias or at our email at info@dcseac.org. We're really excited. We have lots of conversations that are coming up. So until next time, bye.